First, apologies for not being in my robes, which is customary when we give Dharma talks, but when I looked for them this morning, they weren't where they usually are kept. So I assumed they were here, but alas, they're not here either, so they're temporarily in hiding from me. Anyway, good morning, welcome to spring. Beautiful spring day. Special welcome to any of you who are here for the first time. Anyway, our talks this month are on the topic of Theravada Buddhism, which is the oldest surviving school of Buddhism, sometimes referred to as classical Buddhism. As Don told us in his talk last week, Theravada means school or doctrine of the elders. The Theravada school is based on scriptures called suttas of the Tipitaka, or 3 baskets, made up of the Vinaya Pitaka, which is the basket of discipline, meaning the texts concerning rules and customs of the monastic sangha. The Sutta Pitaka, which is the basket of discourses, which means the sermons and utterances of the Buddha and his close disciples. And then thirdly, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which can be thought of as the basket of special or higher doctrine. And this is a detailed psychological, philosophical analysis of the Dhamma. And these three baskets make up a very huge range of teachings, very broad and very deep. So my task in this talk is how to share something meaningful about Theravada Buddhism, something essential in the brief period of a Dharma talk. When I tried to distill the essence of Theravada for myself, thinking about this talk, I thought first of 2 words, suffering and liberation. And then another pair which are closely related, truth and path. And I like the fact that they rhyme with the TH sound at the end. So, what is the truth and what is the path that the Buddha taught? This will be very elementary for those of you who have already studied Buddhism. If you are new to it, then hopefully this will be helpful. The truth is actually the 4 Noble Truths. And the path is the Noble Eightfold Path. And I think it's safe to say that these are the core and most fundamental teachings of the Buddha, although there are many, many more. But we find in many suttas that the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are included in or applied to or encapsulated in many other teachings. So there's a great deal of repetition of these teachings throughout the suttas. So what are the 4 Noble Truths? First, suffering exists. The Pali word for this is dukkha, sometimes translated as dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness. Second, the cause of suffering is craving, the Pali word being tanha, craving for sensuality, for states of becoming, and states of no becoming. Third is that suffering ends with the ending of craving. And the fourth is that there is a path which leads to the end of suffering, to our ability to conquer tanha, or craving. So, as you see, this statement of the Noble Truths concludes with the introduction to the path. And the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path are right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. They're not so much linear steps, not so much progression, but rather qualities that we cultivate and integrate within ourselves so that we become the kind of individual who finally is able to overcome craving or tanha, which in turn brings about suffering or dukkha. So we really practice the steps, the Eightfold Path, all at the same time, not in any linear order. The 8 steps or qualities fall into 3 broader categories, and these are referred to as wisdom, virtue, and concentration. The wisdom qualities come first, namely right view and right intention. Having right view means that we recognize the truth of suffering and the workings of karma. So you see that once you set out on the path, you're actually looking over your shoulder at the Four Noble Truths and bringing them along with you. Right intention, sometimes called resolve, means that we take the path seriously. We have a strong desire to be free of craving and the resulting suffering. Sometimes this intention leads a person to take refuge in the 3 jewels, as we call the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Recognizing that the Buddhist path provides the context and the tools needed to reach the goal, to live a meaningful life, and ultimately to be liberated from suffering. The virtue section of the path consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The Buddha taught that living a virtuous life is essential for gaining liberation from suffering. We practice virtue by keeping our speech honest, mild, and by not using it to harm others. We also always act in ways with our bodies that do no harm to ourselves or others. And the 5 precepts are offered to practitioners when they take refuge and are the ideals of virtuous behavior to support us on the spiritual path of liberation. The 5 precepts are to avoid taking life, to avoid taking what does not belong to us, to avoid harsh or false speech, to avoid sexual misconduct, and to avoid intoxication. By practicing these 5 precepts, we are cultivating right action on the Eightfold Path. Right livelihood is the 3rd part of the virtue segment of the Eightfold Path. Right livelihood reminds us that the way we make our living is extremely important for our spiritual development and success. If we make our living from occupations or industries that take life, that promote violence, that take advantage of people by fostering addictions such as drugs or gambling, then we are directly or indirectly harming others and ourselves. Such activities are huge obstacles to progress on the path of wisdom, virtue, and meditation. The 3rd segment of the path is samadhi, or concentration, consisting of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are the qualities that enable us to meditate, to calm the mind, to develop our concentration and attention, all of which give rise to insight into the true nature of things. This part of the path revolves around meditation practice. Our right effort is what makes our practice regular, frequent, and sincere. It is what stimulates us to make frequent retreats, to seek out guidance from a teacher, to hear Dharma talks, to study the Dharma, and to sit in meditation every day at the same time. And also when we're meditating, to keep coming back, to make a sincere effort to just bring our minds back when they become carried away by distracting thoughts. The Buddha's told us that the Dharma, the ultimate truth of things, is directly visible, timeless, calling out to be approached and seen. He says further that it is always available to us, and that the place where it is to be realized is within oneself. What brings the field of our experience into focus and makes it accessible to insight is a mental faculty called, in the Pali language, sati, usually translated as mindfulness. We exercise mindfulness with what is called bare attention, which means a non-judgmental, calm observation of whatever arises in our awareness, noting the changes, making the effort to keep coming back to the present as soon as we realize that our thoughts have distracted us, as they so often do. There's a wonderful image or analogy about mindfulness, which says that the mind without mindfulness can be compared to a pumpkin. The mind established in mindfulness is like a stone. A pumpkin placed on the surface of a pond soon floats away and always remains on the surface of the water. Whereas a stone does not float away. It stays where it's put and it at once sinks into the water until it reaches bottom. So this is how mindfulness directs our attention and our mind. Right concentration, the last factor of the samadhi segment of the Eightfold Path, is characterized by one-pointedness of mind. It's an essential ingredient of meditation, allowing the mind to become focused, calm, and undistracted. But it's a special kind of wholesome one-pointedness, a deliberate attempt to raise the mind to a higher, more purified level of awareness. And this is to distinguish it from unwholesome focus and concentration, which is available to the worst of criminals. If you think about it, it's very possible to be very concentrated on very unwholesome activities. With concentration, the many strands and energies of the mind are unified with one purpose. When the mind is calmed and unified, the field is prepared for the arising of insight. Like a lake unruffled by any breeze, the concentrated mind is a faithful reflector that mirrors whatever is placed before it, exactly as it is. I mentioned earlier the three jewels, namely the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Sangha refers to the community of practitioners, specifically in Theravada Buddhism, to the monastic communities. Although the Buddha taught all kinds of people, yet to renounce worldly life and become homeless, a wandering monk, dependent on the kindness and generosity of others, was and is considered in Theravada Buddhism the highest calling. To give up the householder's life, to devote oneself to study and practice, is like the fast track to liberation from samsara, the endless round of births and deaths brought about by craving, tanha. The goal of such a life is to become an arahant, one who has freed him or herself from the fetters that tie us to this world and the round of rebirths. So I'm going to tell you what the 10 fetters are. The Sutta Pitaka identifies them as 10 fetters of becoming. The first is belief in a self. The second is doubt or uncertainty, especially about the teachings. Third is attachment to rites and rituals. Fourth is sensual desire. Fifth is ill will. Sixth is lust for material existence or lust for material rebirth. Seventh is lust for immaterial existence or lust for rebirth in a formless realm. Eighth is conceit. Ninth is restlessness. And 10th is ignorance. Before one can achieve the status of an arahant, other stages must be passed through. First, one becomes a stream enterer, a person who sets forth sincerely on the Eightfold Path. Stream enterers are subject to up to 7 more births as a human or in a heaven realm. This is followed by being a once returner, who is subject to only 1 more birth as a human. Then one becomes a non-returner, defined as someone who has cast off the first 5 fetters and has only 1 more birth in a pure abode. When the last 5 fetters are cast off, one becomes an arahant and is no longer subject to further rebirths. I'd like to spend the last few minutes of this talk on what Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi calls the philosophical cornerstone of the Buddha's teaching. This is the process of dependent origination, often referred to as the 12 links of dependent origination. The Buddha declared that he discovered the path to enlightenment only when he found the way to bring dependent origination to an end. Dependent origination is the chain of cause and effect that brings about the suffering of the human condition. With great insight and wisdom, the Buddha penetrated the chain of conditions that brings about the unending cycle of death and rebirth of all beings in the world, a process which we call samsara. As the Buddha related to his disciples and recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya, monks, before my enlightenment, when I was still a bodhisatta, not yet fully enlightened, it occurred to me, alas, this world has fallen into trouble, in that it is born, ages, and dies. It passes away and is reborn, yet it does not understand the escape from this suffering headed by aging and death. When now will an escape be discerned from this suffering headed by aging and death? At this point, the Buddha applied himself to discovering what it is that gives rise to aging and death, what he referred to as the most immediate cause of our suffering. He asked himself, what conditions aging and death? He explains that through careful attention, there took place in him a breakthrough in wisdom. He says, when there is birth, aging and death comes to be. Aging and death has birth as its condition. Continuing on, step by step, the Buddha took each condition and found its causal condition that gives rise to it. He asked what gives rise to birth, and discovered that existence gives rise to birth. What gives rise to existence? Clinging gives rise to existence. What gives rise to clinging? Craving. And to craving, feeling. What gives rise to feeling? Contact. And to contact, the 6 sense bases. What gives rise to the 6 sense bases? Name and form, something which I'll explain a bit more about in a second. Then he asked, by what is name and form conditioned? And the Buddha had another breakthrough by wisdom, realizing that when there is consciousness, name and form comes to be. Name and form has consciousness as its condition. And here's where it gets really interesting. When the Buddha asked himself what gives rise to consciousness, he realized, with another breakthrough by wisdom, that when there is name and form, consciousness comes to be. At this point, it occurred to the Buddha that this consciousness turns back. It does not go further than name and form. So we have a recursiveness there in the chain of cause and effect, name and form and consciousness. So what is name and form? In Pali, it's called nama rupa, and this can be translated as mind and matter, or mentality, physicality. It's basically the union of mental phenomena and physical phenomena conditioned by consciousness. So here's where the Buddha's investigations and contemplation led him from his question about the causes of suffering. The source of suffering, aging and death, birth, existence, etc., is just this consciousness of ours and the interaction of mind and matter. But as we heard earlier, the Buddha said that his enlightenment was only realized not when he realized the origin of suffering, but when he realized how it could cease. He traced the 12 links backward in succession, realizing that as each condition ceased, the result would also cease, all the way back to name and form and consciousness. But if you've been keeping count, you will have recognized that I've mentioned only 10 links in the chain of dependent origination. What about the other 2 that come before consciousness? The first is ignorance, specifically ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. And because of this ignorance, we engage in various wholesome and unwholesome activities of body, speech, and mind called volitional formations, or karma. Bhikkhu Bodhi in his commentary tells us that volitional formations sustain consciousness from one life to the next and determine where it rearises. In this way, volitional formations condition consciousness, and so on. These 2 aspects or links in the chain of dependent origination are sometimes assigned to previous lives, and then the other 10 to the current life and future lives. So that's one way of sort of seeing how they interact. I think the only way to begin to grasp this key teaching of the Buddha is to bear in mind the beginninglessness of life. The links of dependent origination are chained together, but the chain is joined at each end. We can break the chain only by no longer generating kama, or volitional formations. And we do this by bringing ignorance to an end, through realizing the Four Noble Truths, which in turn is the first step or factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha concluded his discourse by saying, "Cessation, cessation. Thus, monks, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, penetration, and light." These realizations discovered by our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, are a precious gem given to us for our liberation. So in conclusion, may all beings penetrate this treasury and its wisdom as unfathomable as the ocean.